he's doing something that all Africans ought to be doing if you take into account our program. I've come to know that if you're black, you are an African, you suffer globally. Not only in South Africa, not only in the continent of Africa, the only one that was so colonized, but wherever you are. You can be in England, the United Kingdom. There are areas that where the blacks are in the majority. London looks different than if you are in Oxford Street, than when you were in what they called the periphery of the city. You are in New York, and you can read and appreciate New York. But if you go to New York, you'll realize it's not as rosy as they paint it. Right now, the life of a black American is not important. It can be shot and killed, and there will be no consequences. But to no white, that can happen. Sitting in prison, deepening my commitment to political struggle, it became very clear. It was not just freedom alone that will change the quality of lives of the Africans, but education was critical. Broadly speaking, knowledge. That we as Africans ought to accumulate knowledge so that we can handle our own affairs. As a young man, listened to one of the leaders, Kwame Nkrumah, who spoke very angrily that let the white men leave us, go back to their place for us to do our things, to manage or even mismanage our things. We should do it. It was an angry statement. So, as I came out of prison, I'd not become a teacher, I'd not become a pastor, I'd not become a lawyer, but I'd become a politician. And I'd learned politics, and I'd understood what is called oppression and exploitation. I wished that many African children, because as an African in an oppressed situation like ours, you are condemned at birth and forever if you don't have education. You remain something undescribable, just a thing. But if you at least have education, you will be able to swim across the flooded rivers. So I continued fighting for our liberation. What I had taken very passionately as I grew up was the culture of reading. I read every other book you can think of, and read books that talked about the conditions of the oppressed. But I realized I had no power, I had no capacity. Even when we got our freedom, we had a very wonderful document that we produced under Mandela's leadership. The RDP, if you put it in full, Reconstruction and Development Program. I loved it because from our point of view, it was all-encompassing. There was a minister without portfolio who ran that kind of department, and in the budget of that department, there was a fund which was called the discretionary fund. In other words, it was not subjected to the bureaucracy of accounting, as it were. It was a segment of money that you could use to solve problems that are not necessarily described in the books. I was working in the province, and my worry about education was continuing. And I was hoping the government can immediately have a policy that will ensure that every African child was at school. But things don't go as you want. I was an MEC, what we call the Provincial Minister of Economic Affairs and Tourism. We took a decision in my province because I had asked to leave the national level. Because what had developed, there was such violence. So many people died because that was worked out by the apartheid regime, that we should kill one another as much as possible. And they called it black on black violence. And they were behind it. So there were many orphans who would either have made it but would not make it because of the situation. So we decided to have a small fund called from the discretionary fund. It was 500,000 rand. And I said, with this money, I'm going to start something to educate, particularly the orphans, the poor people that I saw. I said, but it's very little. What can I do? But I said, nevertheless, there is a theory that it is a spark that burns the prairie. A big fire begins with a spark. Perhaps I can lit the prairie. And we're supposed to deliver in the areas where we stay. I decided to leave everything, water and everything, and established a trust, an education trust. And I wanted this education trust to do the unusual, to start from the orphans, even if they've just been born, or they were 2 years or 3 years, take them up to tertiary. Because many bursaries in our country begin at the tertiary level. There are no bursaries that are known that starts at the most difficult area of the human being. And this is what I established, and there are details to it. And indeed, I started it in my village because I thought it was too small to start it at the national level. And I went to people, to traditional leaders, to their right-hand men, to school principals, etc. And there was violence. It was not easy because people were fighting. Others were thinking, I'm using this for my own benefit. But finally they understood. They knew me. I grew up with them. And I established a trust that is still there, operating. But I realized the trust has a lot of restrictions. So I could not go fully as I will do to an orphan. So I established a foundation which could take all the dimensions of challenges. And that's when I established this foundation. And I'd met this lady who was a small business, but also very passionate about education. And because I was in government, I'd moved from province to the national. And I thought she would be the best to chair my foundation.